Thank you, Suzanne. Thank you, Sharon. That song, You Raise Me Up, puts me in mind of the great affirmation that I first heard from Dorothy Pearson. Maybe we could speak it together. I'll say it once and ask you to join me. Jesus Christ is here now, raising me to His consciousness. Together? Jesus Christ is here now, raising me to His consciousness. So on this particular Sunday, the preacher was standing at the door, as he always did, to shake hands. He grabbed an elderly gentleman by a hand and pulled him aside and said, "Fred, you need to join the army of the Lord." And Fred replied, "Well, I'm already in the army of the Lord, Pastor." Well, Pastor questioned him, somewhat puzzled, said, "Well, how come I don't see you except at Christmas and Easter?" Well, Fred said, "I'm in the Secret Service." I was listening to Suzanne's introduction. I'm not blonde either, so we'll see how this works. Whatever. I've been looking forward to this opportunity to share with you some experiences I've had in my life in struggling with our unity principles. And maybe I'm the only one who's done this, and maybe what I'm about to share everybody in this room already knows, but in case there's one or two of us that don't quite get these things, I'd like to share some breakthroughs I've had in learning how to practice our principles. I call this addressing the two-mind problem that Charles Fillmore identified. And ultimately, it leads to our befriending our shadow, befriending those thoughts of negativity and fear and lack that Suzanne shared with us in the meditation. And I'd like to start out with a scriptural reference. I'd like to create a reference point for us that Jesus taught. This is from Matthew 5, verse 43 to 45, and this is from the George Lamsa translation that Cherie introduced to us a couple weeks ago. "You have heard it said, 'Be kind to your friend and hate your enemy.' But I say to you, love your enemies and bless anyone who curses you, and do good to anyone who hates you, and pray for them who carry you away by force and persecute you, so that you may become sons of your Father who is in heaven, who causes the sun to shine upon the good and upon the bad, and who pours down His rain upon the just and upon the unjust. Love your enemies." So, keeping that in mind, I want to talk about what was a missing link for me in understanding our unity principles and learning the secret to manifestation and demonstration. When I first started attending services at Christ Unity was about 1998. And like many of us, my first visit to the church, this was over on Folsom Boulevard, I had this experience of coming home. I sat in the back. I sat underneath Stu Boyer in the little window where the sound system was, because I was new, so I could sit in the back, of course. So the people in the back, we couldn't get it. And Dorothy Pearson came out and she said, as Suzanne shared with us, "There is only one presence and one power active in my life, God the good, omnipotent." I had never heard anyone ever say that before. But I burst into tears because it was so true. It was a truth that I had come to believe through my own study. And I was so pleasantly surprised to find out there was actually an organized group of people who believed as I did. And I felt, therefore, like I had come home. And so like many of us, when we've had that experience, when we came to Unity, I was eager to learn everything I could about this Unity message. So I studied Lessons in Truth. I took classes on it. I went to, participated in Stretton Smith's 4T. How many people have done 4T? I even had the opportunity to co-facilitate that with Dorothy. I studied the origins of New Thought. Looked at the work of Phineas Quimby and Mary Baker Eddy and all those who came before the Fillmores. I even, at the urging of Phil and Dorothy, went and got a degree in consciousness studies at JFK University in Orinda. I'd always been reading about this stuff. In fact, what brought me to Unity was my readings about quantum physics. Sound familiar? I'd read the Tao of Physics. Anybody read the Tao of Physics? Or I read Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance back in the 80s. And other such works as Amit Goswami's The Self-Aware Universe, Tim Ferriss's Coming of Age in the Milky Way, Fred Alan Wolf, Taking the Quantum Leap, and many, many others. These readings that I had been doing on my own and then coming into Unity led me to understand and intellectually agree that everything is divine universal mind, and that the dynamics of this God mind, the source of all creativity, are totally 24/7, 365 days available to me and to each of us, because we are individualized expression of God mind. So remember the 5 principles of unity. 1, God is the source and creator of all and is everywhere present. 2, we are spiritual beings created in God's image. 3, we create our life experiences through our thinking and our word. 4, affirmative prayer and meditation are the vehicles by which we activate contact with God mind and thereby change our world. And 5, this is the tough one. This was my stumbling block. Knowledge of these spiritual principles is not enough to manifest the changes we desire. We must actually live them. So when I took 4T, I think the power of that, and I want to acknowledge Pat Nielsen, because Pat, you remember when you got up and you talked about how 4T helped you kick smoking habit? That's what sold me on going to 4T, so thank you for being my leader and way shower on that one. 4T taught me a lot about affirmative prayer and going into the details of that and helping us work all that. And at the time, I was looking back on my shoulder to a period in my life where I had found myself deeply in debt, and having that kind of situation where creditors were calling and I had to make arrangements with the IRS to pay back taxes, waking up in the middle of the night trembling in fear. And I worked really, really hard to get out of that. And I said to myself, I'm never, ever going to do that again. Never going to happen. So when I got to 4T and I learned about affirmative prayer, I began to affirm prosperity, because 4T was a prosperity course. And I had enough prosperity to be able to buy a house for the first time in my life. And although it was stretching my budget in order to do that, I felt very proud. I felt like I'd entered that posh lobby of the beautiful hotel. Remember, Stretton invites us in one of the early lessons to sit down and just imagine ourselves surrounded by luxury. And I was in this beautiful house, and I found myself surrounded by this great luxury that my prosperity consciousness had manifest. Well, several years later, not several years later, came the great financial crash in 2008. And I had my salary cut. I was on an adjustable mortgage. The rate went up. And so the debts that I had been able to finesse now became a burden and became impossible to really manage. I would come to the 3rd week of the month and have no money to get through the rest of the month. So, and again, I was waking up in the middle of the night in that panic of fear. What am I going to do? And in my feverish imagination, I saw myself out on the curb in front of my house with a few possessions left that I'd managed to keep after selling everything else off. So I'd been affirming prosperity, and I found myself on the edge of bankruptcy again. I had promised myself this would never happen, and here I was again. What was wrong with me? Because it was my fault. I was doing something wrong. Everybody else was affirming prosperity. Pat was affirming kicking the smoking habit. She never smoked again, and here I was affirming prosperity, and I couldn't afford the life that I had already affirmed. So as you can imagine, I felt embarrassed, ashamed, frightened, abandoned. I felt thoroughly defective. Because in spite of all of my affirmations, the opposite of prosperity was what was showing up. And the kicker is, I was the board president of Christ Unity Church, so I was supposed to be a role model. And I was not. So it was around that time, so God takes care. God takes care, usually in ways that we're not aware of. What happened was, some of you may recall that Jim Lee had started a men's work at Christ Unity Church, and many of my brothers are here today. And in the course of that men's work, I got introduced to a gentleman named John Donovan. So John Donovan did a seminar at the urging of some of us, a weekend seminar, to teach us some of the things that he knew. And much like Charles and Myrtle Fillmore going to a meeting led by E.B. Weeks, this was my E.B. Weeks experience. I went to this seminar that John put together, and what he taught me that day led me to appreciate the power of our teachings by providing a method of unifying what I was experiencing as two warring minds. I was of two minds. I was affirming prosperity and I was getting bankruptcy. So I realized that negative, lack and limitation experience I was having was being generated by me. I just had no clue on how it was happening. Sometimes I would meditate about it and I would literally feel like something was grabbing my throat as I would try to affirm prosperity. Literally having a physical reaction against that. And I had no clue what was going on. But here's what John taught me. And this is not new. I had a formal understanding of this, but it didn't have any power for me until I went through this experience. So John suggested that our entire mind comprises both the conscious and subconscious elements. In fact, the subconscious represents about 90% of what's going on in our minds at any given time. So to be subconscious means it's not on the screen of our awareness, but it's available. We can access it. There in the darkness of my subconscious, there's physical sensations, there's the autonomic bodily activity that's going on, keeping the heartbeat, regulating what's going on in the body. But there's also all of the memories of my life, going back possibly to the moment of the beginning, 9 months before I was born. Every sensation that's occurred is buried in my subconscious, it's buried in our subconscious, and we can actually access all of this history, all of this memory, if we have the appropriate technologies to do that. So for example, the easiest way to do this is simply to, right now, take a moment and notice the voice in your head. Whatever the voice is saying, the voice is actually speaking from our subconscious. You'll notice if you pay attention to the voice long enough, again, Suzanne mentioned this in her meditation for us, you'll notice that the voice is never saying anything new. The voice is almost like an automatic pilot. Who do you think you are? This is not working for me. You have no idea what you're doing. It's usually a critical voice, a negative voice. That's because this voice is drawing on a memory of which we may not be conscious. I want to make a distinction now between that voice, the critical voice, and intuition. Intuition is a voice that comes from the beyond. It comes from what Charles Fillmore called the superconscious, the divine mind. The intuitive voice almost has something new to say. The critical voice never has anything new to say. It just has a tape that's been looping over and over in our lives since as far back as we can remember. So that's one way that we can access the subconscious. Another way we can access it, again, Suzanne shared this with us in her meditation. I'd like you to draw your attention to the bottom of your left foot. Notice the sensation on the bottom of your left foot, and notice that sensation's always there. It's just we're not aware of it. We have other things our mind needs to be focusing on, but we can focus on, or we can call it to mind, many of the things that are lying in our subconscious all the time. Another thing, the old tip of the tongue experience. You know, I was talking to that guy about his daughter going to Harvard. What was that guy's name? And just a little bit of effort you might be able to bring to awareness the name of the person that you're trying to remember. But on the other hand, some of our memories are so deep or so old that we need specialized help, specialized technology like hypnotherapy to access. But anybody who's worked with hypnotherapy knows that it's possible to access some really hidden information, emotional resonances, thoughts, beliefs that we may have had years and years ago, but we no longer think of. It's no longer part of our conscious awareness. And then there's those parts of our subconscious that are not merely buried deeply, but they're actually something we've actively repressed into something that Jung called the shadow. These are memories, feelings, experiences that were so traumatic at the moment that we had them, that we said to ourselves in whatever way that we could, because this generally happens in the first 2-3 years of our lives, where we don't have command of language yet, somehow we made a decision, I don't ever want to experience this again. I cannot experience this again. For many of us, those experiences were so traumatic they felt like death. And so we simply repressed them. And when we repressed them, we lost contact with them. There's no direct method to get to those shadow memories, shadow experiences. There are indirect methods, and that's what I'm going to share how that happened for me. But I want to quote Jung on the shadow. He says, "The shadow personifies everything that the subject refuses to acknowledge about himself. It represents," he says, "a tight passage, a narrow door, whose painful constriction no one is spared who goes down into the deep well. If and when," he says, "an individual makes an attempt to see his shadow, he becomes aware of, and often ashamed of, those qualities and impulses he denies in himself, but can plainly see in others. Such things as egotism, mental laziness and sloppiness, unreal fantasies, schemes and plots, carelessness and cowardice, inordinate love of money and possession." Jung suggests that integrating these shadow memories and beliefs involves a painful and lengthy work of self-education. You got that right. What primarily resides in our shadow subconscious, as I said, are all the experiences we had as little children in the first years of our lives, when we were beginning the traumatic work, and every human being goes through this, the traumatic work of separating from our primary caregiver, almost always, but not entirely always, our mother, and starting the arduous process of individuating, of becoming our individual selves. This is a traumatic and often violent experience because the young infant has no clue this is coming. So when we're born, we come out of the womb where everything is copacetic and harmonic. There's a sense of oceanic universality, and then all of a sudden we're born, and the separation begins. Now, most of us, if we actually had a conscious choice, we probably wouldn't vote for it. We probably wouldn't think that's a great idea, but there's no choice. We all go through it. So this can be a very, very traumatic experience. And if you happen to be born into a family where there's a certain level of dysfunction, the trauma gets multiplied. It gets expanded upon. Perhaps one or both of our parents are already suffering from their own traumatic memories that they can't access, their own shadow material, and they're going to bring that to raising their children, whether they know it or not. In my family, for example, just give you an example of this. My parents were 20 when they got married. My mom was 21 when I was born. She had 10 kids in the course of 12 years, 4 of whom died in infancy. In addition, their parents were alcoholics, and my parents didn't call themselves alcoholics, they simply drank instead. So I was raised in an atmosphere of death and addiction through alcohol. My memories are a lot of rage, a lot of my father running away and saying, "I'm not staying in this house anymore." And my little Marty just has to figure out a way to cope with this, because we all start to think that's our fault. Our parents are doing this because there's something wrong with us. Now, who wants to live with that belief? Who wants to live with the self-belief there's something so defective with me that my parents are crazy? So we repress those things into the shadow because they're too painful for us to carry, and we have no way, there's no way for me to go to my parents and say, "Please fix this, please stop this, please don't do this," because I'm assuming it's my problem. Again, because I have no other way of understanding this, and we don't live in a culture yet where we have taught our parents how to deal with this for our children at the youngest age. Some of you may have read some really important work that's done on investigating how this works. Alice Miller, who wrote the drama The Gifted Child, Ted Rubin, Karen Horney, they've all extensively studied the impact that such traumas produce on the development of young children in this pre-verbal time of our lives. Recently, because of what happened in Vietnam with post-traumatic stress disorder, there's been a lot of research into the actual impact of physical brain chemistry that trauma induces, so that not only do our beliefs and thoughts get impacted and affected by these experiences as young children, but our brain chemistry adapts to manage all of that for us. And that brain chemistry is there, invisible, in our subconscious, doing its thing. We've all adapted to it. The crazy critical voice is part of that mechanism, and we're completely unaware of it as we grow. So one of the ways that we can become aware of these shadow elements is through the mechanism of projection. Now, most of us know what projection is. It's the unconscious casting of repressed shadow memories, beliefs, and feelings upon someone or thing outside of ourselves. And the single unfailing way, most of us know this, to become aware of projection is when something or someone pushes our button. When someone triggers an unexpected emotional response in me, it's almost always because the person is mirroring for me something about myself that I simply cannot own. So I'm not like that. That's not me. And I'm sure I'm not alone in this experience. You can think about, maybe there's some people that have avoided running into people that push your buttons, and God bless you for that. But for the rest of us, we've run into these situations. Sometimes we just run into them when we're driving, and some idiot cuts us off and we get angry. Well, who's the idiot? What are we repressing at that moment? And I tell the truth, I've met some people in our unity movement that have pressed my button. So I blessed them because they were telling me something about myself, but at that time I didn't know it yet. So I formally knew about the shadow. I'd studied the stuff. I'd got my master's degree in consciousness studies, so we went into a lot of these psychological and psychospiritual mechanisms. But it was only when I met John Donovan that I began to become aware that I have this very active and powerful and dynamic shadow material living inside myself, and that the best opportunity was to become aware of it and to befriend it. Because what I discovered in the course of investigating this is that in every instance where I had failed to manifest a desired outcome, I failed to manifest prosperity through my affirmation work, is not because affirmations don't work, because they work very well, but because it was something in my subconscious mind that was affirming something completely opposite to what my conscious mind was affirming. That's the two-mind problem that Charles Fillmore talks about. It turned out in the period when I had my second financial challenge, the one I'd promised would never ever happen again, was that something in my subconscious mind, deeply buried in the shadow, was merrily affirming bankruptcy and ignoring and negating my conscious affirmation of prosperity. I was feeling of two minds. I had that sense that something was constricting me. So one of the things that John did when we met him is he became available to facilitate our group, and our group decided we really wanted to work on the shadow, on uncovering these elements that we simply felt we were being run by. We were not running our lives, we were being run by the shadow element. And I found out this work is best done in a group of like-minded souls who are all working on their own shadow work, because what pushes my button doesn't push yours. And so you can bear witness to my struggles to become unconscious without being triggered. And being in a room of people that are not triggered by what I'm triggered with is healing, because they provide for me unconditional love and possibility of that whatever I tell them, whatever I reveal that's in my shadow, they're not going to run screaming from the room. They're not going to run screaming from the room because they have their own stuff they're dealing with. That stuff doesn't trigger me. So we make a mutual agreement to stick with each other as we dig into the subterranean depths of our subconscious. So here's the key thing. This is what I began to understand is, we talk about in unity that thoughts held in mind produce after their kind. But what I came to understand through working with John is, this cannot be otherwise. As John used to say, we cannot not manifest. Right now, as we're sitting in this room, we're manifesting our lives just as they are. Right here, right now, in every second of our lives, we're manifesting through our words and our beliefs the experience that we have on the outside, the other side of our face. And this is, of course, a universal principle that's acknowledged in our own scriptures. In the beginning of the Gospel of John, the Word was in the beginning, and that very Word was with God, and God was that Word. The same was in the beginning with God. Everything came to be by His hand. Without Him, not even one thing that was created came to be. This is the way it works. We manifest our lives with our words, and our words are generated in our minds, both in our subconscious and our conscious minds. So if I think I'm affirming prosperity, but I'm getting bankruptcy, then it follows logically from universal law that somewhere, somehow, I am actually affirming bankruptcy. If the law works everywhere and every time, then I cannot be an exception. I get bankruptcy because I think somewhere in my subconscious mind that my conscious mind is not accessing that financial lack is what I really want. So with a lot of love and compassion from the men in my group, it began to dawn on me the possibility that what I actually had in my life, the actual content and structure of my life as it was, struggling with financial solvency, was what I wanted deep down inside. And therefore, I was manifesting it. So the next step was the toughest, because it really felt shameful to say this out loud. But it was also the most unexpectedly liberating. I became willing to affirm that at some deep level of my subconscious, I wanted poverty and bankruptcy. What I actually said out loud to the group was, I'm willing to say I like being in debt. I was willing to own the truth that the poverty that was in my life I had created, and I was willing to own that truth. And the moment I did that, the moment I owned that, everything changed. The compulsion to be in debt disappeared. And the moment that I declared my actual love of being in financial hardship, which was proved by all the zeros in my bank account, my need to be in the state lost its power. My higher power was activated. By speaking the truth, the higher power was activated. And in that moment, my subconscious and conscious mind became one. And within the next 3 years, not only did I erase tens of thousands of dollars of debt, but to my amazement, I had tens of thousands of dollars in my bank account. But I got to tell you, in all my years of studying truth, principles, and unity, I had never heard anybody explain about the two-mind problem. I'd never heard anybody explain that subconscious thoughts held in mind produce after their kind. Nobody explained how I could affirm prosperity and manifest bankruptcy at the same time. Now maybe I wasn't listening, and I'm willing to own that. But Charles Fillmore understood this, and I've been reading Fillmore's stuff for a long time, but it was this year in reading Keep a True Lent that I came across a chapter called Conscious Mind and Subconscious Mind, where Fillmore says, the subconscious mind is the vast silent realm that lies back of the conscious mind and between it and the superconscious, which is also another word for the divine mind. To one who does not understand its nature and its office, it is the great gulf fixed between his present state and the attainment of his highest desire, his good. The subconscious may also be called the sensitive plate of mind. Its true office, that is what it was originally designed for, is to receive impressions from the superconscious, divine mind, and to reproduce them upon the canvas of his conscious mind. Man, however, having lost the consciousness of the indwelling Father as an ever-present reality, remember Phil's lessons on the Garden of Eden, has reversed the process and impresses the subconscious mind from the conscious mind. In this way, the former is made to register impressions of both good and evil according to the thought held in conscious mind at the time the impression is made. So what the little boy or little girl is dealing with in the trauma, that impression of what's going on and whatever orientation the child chooses to make with it gets impressed into the subconscious mind out of that consciousness. And since its purpose, Charles Fillmore says, and the nature of the subconscious mind is to reproduce or throw upon the screen of our consciousness the exact impression that it has received, the conscious mind is thus made to express two sets of opposing ideas. No enduring structure can be built by one who is a double-minded man, unstable in all his ways. But here's the good news. Charles Fillmore goes on to say, the subconscious mind can be trained by the conscious to work systematically and reliably, but, and here's the kicker, the conscious mind must be faithful and consistent in creating the impressions that it seeks to make upon the subconscious. The superconsciousness reaches to the depths of the subconscious and sets free the energies bound in error thought. So error thought are simply all of the collection of things that we are at war with internally. That having been done, man can easily reach and mold the subconscious in harmony with divine ideas. The regeneration, Charles Fillmore says, of the subconscious is not the work of the conscious, but of the superconscious mind acting in harmony with the conscious. In other words, of ourselves, we have no idea how this works. My conscious mind isn't smart enough to help heal what's in my subconscious, but God is. Divine mind is. So when I make my affirmation consciously and I hook that to divine mind with the strict and consistent intention of knowing all of the truth of myself, then the divine mind takes care of the problem. It's a version of let go and let God. So the key to accessing all of our powers to consciously create the life we desire is to discover what lies hidden and often unloved in our subconscious, and especially what abides in our shadow. The unwanted traumas, fears, and prejudices that live there are in fact the fertile ground of our actual lives. And when we become willing to know them, to embrace them, to love them, then we truly enter into the realm of infinite possibility. So if instead of fighting our thoughts, repressing our fears, condemning our failures, if instead of all that we learn to love them unconditionally, I think we will discover the genuine power of what Jesus tells us in Matthew about loving our enemies. For when we, instead of regarding our faults and deficiencies as enemies to be vanquished, we love them as the Father loves us, then we will have direct life-affirming experience of being here and now, the actual sons and daughters of our Father who is in heaven, as Jesus says. So often we endure without awareness of just where it's coming from, this internal critical voice that belittles us, calls us names, makes fun of our attempts to grow and develop. Well, consider the possibility this is just the subconscious mind's way of getting our attention. The critical voice, as a relic of our earliest days as vulnerable little children, is a product of unenlightened and unsupported attempts to end suffering that we were experiencing through emotional and sometimes even physical trauma. I've come to realize that this voice and the painful memories that shaped it are thoroughly, 100% part of me, part of the divine creation that I am. And as Dorothy Pearson used to say, God doesn't make mistakes. The internal critic may seem to disagree with God about that and think that I am a mistake. And it is what Charles Fillmore refers to as error thought, but it's just a tedious tape loop playing endlessly and effortlessly in our heads. But here's what I've come to understand. Error thought is not our enemy. Error thought is our friend. Error thought is us. So our affirmations actually grow in power as we become aware of the simple truth, and we open ourselves to embracing, instead of resisting, the critical dynamics found in our subconscious mind and in the shadow. Excuse me. Befriending the shadow clears the way for our deepest desires to be manifest in our lives through our conscious intentions, for it eliminates the double-mindedness that Fillmore said so consistently can impede our spiritual growth. So when I embraced my subconscious desires to be in debt, when I stopped trying to stifle or change them, look what happened. I allowed them to exist just as they are on their own terms. The voice of the little child manifest out of fear and trauma, showing up as I would like to be in debt. I said to that little voice, you may be who you are. I accept you and love you just as you are. I will not try to change you. You're whole, complete, and perfect just as the way you are. I was able to give that voice its due. I stopped being in opposition to myself. I united my subconscious and conscious desires and ceased being at war within. So, this is what I believe. I'll conclude on this thought. That when I learn to love the enemies within me, when I learn to see there's absolutely nothing wrong, God did not make a mistake, and I own that God did not make a mistake, when I'm willing to allow the critical voice to be just as it is, And when I can't stand it myself, rather than being at war with myself, I simply go to the people in my life and say, I need some time. Would you be willing to listen? Because I'm struggling and I don't want to be in struggle. And I can't do this by myself. When I do that, when we do that, we create the possibility of truly loving our enemies on the outside of ourselves as well. Because we become aware that every one of us is going through this. There isn't a single person that isn't going through this sense of trauma in the commitment to self-development. Every one of us is just like this. We are truly one in the way that we are. But I can only understand that about you when I learn to understand that about me. This, I affirm, loving the enemy within is the key to genuine peace and prosperity. So let us pray. Divine Presence, sometimes to us you seem a puzzle. But when we open ourselves to how you are activated in every part of us, in both our conscious and subconscious minds, we become aware of the beauty and the simplicity of your creation. We become aware of the beauty and simplicity of the creation that we, each of us, are. And we thank you that you have made it so. We thank you that you sent us your way shower to challenge us, to cherish us, and to show us how to be in love with our enemies. And for this, we say, thank you, God. Amen.